In between all the analysis of Matt Eberflus staying and Luke Getsy being fired and Ryan Poles outlining the plan for the number one overall pick and Justin Fields, there were some other nuggets in the Chicago Bears end of the season press conference yesterday that I want to get into about some key players entering free agency and some other guys who we're not sure how much they're going to stick around or in what role.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including YouTube, where you can subscribe to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, we dive into some of the other things Ryan Poles said this week at his press conference that laid out some of their plans, or at least their ideas for what they want to do with a couple of key free agents. We heard about Jaylen Johnson. Sure sounds like he's going to be back in one way or another. We'll take a look at what that might look like and hear what Ryan Poles said. Then Darnell Mooney certainly didn't say for sure that Mooney won't be back, but the way Poles talked about it sure made it seem unlikely that the Bears will bring back Darnell Mooney as a free agent. And then we'll wrap up talking about a couple of other veteran players on this team that are under contract, but we're not really sure, A, will they be back, or B, if they are back, will they be back as a starter, or will the Bears look to add competition or upgrade from what they've got at those spots and ultimately, decide to move on in one way or another. But I think the big headliner was Jaylen Johnson. He is the big free agent that is at the top of the list for the Chicago Bears. He had the best season of his career. He had the best season maybe of any cornerback in the league this year. He was Pro Football Focus's highest graded cornerback overall and highest graded cornerback in coverage. He had the lowest passer rating when targeted of any cornerback in the NFL this season. That when you throw an incomplete pass in the ground, when you just throw incompletions without interceptions, your passer rating is higher than your passer rating if you targeted Jaylon Johnson. You'd be better off, statistically, throwing the pass into the ground than you were targeting Jaylen Johnson this season. That's how great of a year he had. He's clearly the top cornerback entering free agency and debatably one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL. We can get into some of the nuance of the argument there, but he is a high priority here. And as Ryan Poles talks about it, he's a high priority for them entering free agency, and they don't really have plans to let him walk.
Ryan, what are your next steps in re-engaging with Jaylen Johnson's camp as far as negotiations?
Yeah, we have really good communication. The big thing was just kind of take a break here after the season, and then we'll start talks again. I feel really good about that situation. Jaylen's not going to go anywhere, and we'll work through to get something done.
The key phrase there, Jaylen's not going anywhere. That to me seems pretty definitive that they're not going to let him walk in free agency, and presumably, for now, they're not planning on trading him either. Now, Jaylen not going anywhere can mean one of two things, though. It either means, and he sounds pretty confident that they will work out a long-term contract extension, right? He said, I think we'll get something done. We'll get a deal done. I feel good about that, was the phrasing Ryan Poles used there. We can definitely, take his word on that. He's talked before about feeling pretty good about getting a deal done with Montez Sweat and then gets a deal done, right? And when he doesn't say he feels good about it, it doesn't always end up working out. But we've seen, okay, now, when he says, I feel pretty good about it, that's usually a pretty good sign. But even if they don't immediately work out a long-term contract extension, what Ryan Poles signaled to me more definitively is that we will for sure franchise tag him if he does not work out a long-term deal. Like one way or another, Jaylen's not going anywhere. We're either going to get the long-term deal done or we're going to use the franchise tag and make sure that he stays around. Like, that's clearly the emphasis from Ryan Poles. They're not going to lose him for nothing. Now, sure, if negotiations break down and he's already franchise tagged, could you talk about trading him sometime down the line if things really go south? Yeah, but that doesn't seem to be Ryan Poles' plan or anything that Ryan Poles feels like is within the greater realm of possibility. It's just about, okay, how do we find out a way to make these contract numbers work? Because again, we've talked about it a little bit over the course of the season, and maybe we'll still bring on Brad Spielberger from Pro Football Focus, who's the salary cap guru of the sports media world, or at least the NFL media world. But as far as what that Jaylen Johnson contract value is, we saw where he was at the start of the season and where he is at the end of the season are definitely two different contract values. Like when you look at some of the top salaries for cornerbacks in terms of per year average over overthecap.com, for example, you do see that the top cornerback in the NFL in terms of per year average is Jaire Alexander. And then Denzel Ward at $20 million, Jaire Alexander's at 21, Denzel Ward at 20, Jalen Ramsey at 20, and then Marlon Humphrey at 19.5, Trayvon Diggs at just under 19.5. That's the market we're talking about for Jaylen Johnson. Now, guaranteed money and percentage of that's guaranteed is also a really big factor in there. Like per year average is not the sole measurement task of what these contracts are worth, but it's certainly the easiest, because it's a yearly average. It's the easiest thing for us to be able to compare to deals that are, some deals are longer, going to have bigger volume numbers, but it's the per year average stuff that equals out. Is it more important for Jaylen Johnson to be number one in per year average at $22 million a year? Or is it more important for Jaylen Johnson to get as much guaranteed money as possible, get that fully guaranteed number up super high, and then maybe he's not the highest in terms of per year average, but the highest in terms of guarantees, and maybe other circumstances in the contract that might be valuable to him in terms of injury guarantees or other issues like that. Like it's not purely how much per year are you willing to pay Jaylen Johnson, but also how much you were willing to guarantee and how do you structure those guarantees and how do the Bears structure those guarantees so that, they've got their own sort of salary protection in there in case something goes wrong or in case the injury history becomes more of a problem there. It's all about the different options that you might have for trying to find the numbers that work best for both sides, and that's what they're kind of re-engaging on, as we heard Ryan Poles say there. So positive signs for those of you that want Jaylen Johnson back. I think it's the right move for the Chicago Bears, and it sounds like that thing is moving forward. In the opposite direction, it sounds to me like Darnell Mooney will not be back. Ryan Poles didn't say that explicitly, but the way he talked about Darnell Mooney made it seem like probably going to most likely go in different directions this offseason. We'll hear what Poles said and kind of look at this season for Mooney and what might be next for him next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. Gametime is the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. Excuse me. Wow, that's a tough one. Gametime is the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. It gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase because they have a lowest price guarantee where if you find tickets in the same section and roll for less, they'll credit you for 110% of the difference, and you can view your view from your seat before you buy your tickets so you know exactly what to expect when to arrive. I used Gametime a couple times this year to go to Soldier Field and see the Chicago Bears in person. I got a great price on my tickets. I got to see where my seats were, and it really made the experience super easy to go through. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So we feel like Jaylen Johnson is on his way back. Sure seems like the most likely outcome here for the star cornerback that clearly the Bears have a lot of interest in retaining, but a little bit less clear for Darnell Mooney, who everyone seems to like. I mean, I love Darnell Mooney. I'm easy to root for, a guy that we wanted to be successful and just ultimately wasn't. This was not a good season for Darnell Mooney. He's kind of admitted as much, like disappointing. He had a career low 31 catches for 414 yards and 1 touchdown. All 3 of those numbers are career lows. I guess his yards per reception was not a career low. It actually was a career high in yards per reception at 13.4, but generally not nearly as productive as he's been in the past, not nearly as productive as you would have wanted him to. And it wasn't like we were sitting there feeling like he was the problem per se, right? Like he wasn't being a malcontent. He generally still seemed to be running good routes. He was still trying hard. He was making plays after the catch when he did get the ball. He just didn't get the ball all that much. And so, like, I don't know, it doesn't feel like he's like washed all of a sudden per se, but at the same time, you know, depending on what they do with offensive coordinator and quarterback, and if they're going to draft a wide receiver this year, maybe it just is time to move on and go for something else at the wide receiver position. Here's what Ryan Poles said about Darnell Mooney's season and the kind of the way he talks about him as maybe or maybe not part of this long-term plan.
Ryan, what about Mooney? Where do you stand on Mooney? He was one of the guys you were really high on when you came in. The production has dipped a lot. He's going to be a free agent now.
Yeah. Again, we'll evaluate the whole year and be, like I told a lot of the guys that are free agents, you know, we'll be in contact with them in terms of our direction. You know, there's different buckets. There's guys that are going to have to go test the market and kind of see what's out there for them, and maybe they circle back. But yeah, I know, you know, Mooney wishes he played a little bit better this year and things went better for him and made some more connections. But I know he's going to bounce back and have a really good career.
How much of that do you put on his dip in production? How much of that do you put on the coaching staff not maximizing the talent of a player that was a 1,000-yard receiver before you got here?
Yeah, you got to look at everything. But I also think there's an impact. I think Cole's targets went up, and you got DJ that gets added. You know, he was missed early. You know, was it training camp OTAs, just coming back from the injury. So there's a lot of factors in there.
A couple of key phrases there from Ryan Poles, or a couple of key moments in there. One, when he was talking about other free agents, he only mentioned like one specific bucket that those free agents might fall in. He basically talked about, you know, guys who will let them test the market and see, you know, and then maybe if they test the market and realize they're not going to get much money and they could come back here really cheap, maybe then we would consider bringing them back, but otherwise probably not. To me, he's putting Darnell Mooney in that bucket, where it's not like they wouldn't take Darnell Mooney back under any circumstances, but I think they look at Mooney and say, listen, we're not going to pay top dollar for you. You know, we're willing to pay a very small amount to bring you back and let you compete, but if you can find any kind of more money somewhere else or a better opportunity, go ahead. But if you'd come back here super cheap just because you like Chicago and Fields or whatever, like, you know, we're not going to say, no, we won't take you back on the cheap, but we're not going to show you a lot of value in you and really try and pay for you to show that, like, we really, really want you here. It's more like, hey, we'll take you, but we're not going to try hard for you. Like, that to me feels like their approach for Mooney. They're not ruling out the possibility of him coming back, but like, it's more Mooney's choice if he wants to come back here cheap and low, or if you'd rather go somewhere else, try and get a little more money and maybe a little bit better opportunity. Because I think the Bears are planning for a future without Darnell Mooney, but could still add Darnell Mooney into that plan. But you're planning as though you need another receiver to be the number 2 for DJ Moore, and that's not going to be Mooney. Mooney could come back and be a 3 or 4 type in your plan, in, you know, coming back. But other than that, sounds like kind of like ready to let him go. Because the other way that Ryan Poles talked about it later on in there was like, he's still the player that I think can, or like I'm rooting for him in the rest of his career. A player I think he can still have a good career, or still something about Mooney's career. And I hate to like read too much into specific words, but like when we've heard Ryan Poles talk about players, when he thinks they're a part of the plan, you know, he can still have a productive future with us. You know, he can still have a good career with us. We think he can still be helpful for us for a long time. You know, there's always a little bit more of a framing of like, he can do that here. Not just like, he can still have a good career, like implies he can still have a good career somewhere else. He's still going to have a good career, parentheses, just not here, right? Like usually there's some sort of phrasing about how like, we still believe in him as a guy that can help us. You know, like if they were going to bring Darnell Mooney back, or we're as confident that like he's a guy we really want back, Ryan Poles would have talked about like, yeah, he's a free agent, so we'll see how it goes, but we still think he could be really helpful for our team, and we still think he can be a part of our offense here, but we'll see how free agency goes. Like, that would have been how he talks about it if they really thought Mooney would be back. But the fact that, he's like in this free agent bucket where we'll see how that goes when they test the market, but we still think he could still have a good career. Like, that implies a good career somewhere else, and that career is not necessarily going to be as a Chicago Bear. Like, that's kind of the Darnell Mooney feeling I get, which is a shame because, you heard it even in the question there. Like, this is a 1,000-yard receiver and a guy who you feel like has a lot more talent than what he produced for the Chicago Bears this past season. And it feels like the combination of offensive coordinator play calling and also quarterback play, in the sense that, like, Getsy didn't put Fields in the best position to be successful, so then it was hard for Fields to produce enough for Mooney to also be successful, in addition to DJ Moore and Cole Kmet in there. Like, it feels like it largely, some of it has to be Mooney's fault. It can't purely not be Mooney's fault. Other players were productive in this offense, right? It wasn't purely, like, it's not like it's 0% Darnell Mooney's fault, but it certainly doesn't feel like it's greater than 50% Darnell Mooney's fault. Like, I don't know what number I'd put on it. Is it 20% Mooney's fault, 40% Mooney's fault, 10% Mooney's fault? I don't know. But it feels like the reason Darnell Mooney was not productive in Chicago this season feels more outside of Darnell Mooney's control than inside Darnell Mooney's control. It still largely felt like he was doing most of the things, if not all of the things, that he needed to do to be successful. And other circumstances around him on offense kept him from being successful. But then if he goes to another team that can utilize him better, I would think he should still be very successful, and that he could still be very successful on the Bears if they brought him back and like used him more properly and featured him more in the offense. So I would still think he would be worth bringing back, but the Bears obviously know a lot more than we do and might know more of the background there and might have a better reason and explanation as to why Mooney wasn't more productive and why ultimately they might decide not to bring him back. So that kind of leaves, I guess, the end of an era for Mooney. Like, Darnell Mooney was so easy to root for. Came in as a 5th-round pick, somebody that, you could easily love with how quickly he burst onto the scene and just be a difference maker right away in this offense. Exceeded expectations. Was a great draft pick, not a good draft pick, a great draft pick by Ryan Pace in the 5th round of the 2020 NFL draft. Like, that's a great pick and a player who definitely panned out. Like, I wish Darnell Mooney all the best of luck in his career. I wish he would still be in Chicago next season, but I think Ryan Poles is telling us brace for the Darnell Mooney departure. Those two were kind of the clearest crystal ball that Ryan Poles gave us. Like, Jaylen Johnson back, Darnell Mooney probably not back. There were a couple others that to me felt a little bit less clear, like that were not ringing endorsements of we're going to bring this guy back, but also not a ringing endorsement of we're for sure going to replace or try and upgrade from this guy either. And so I want to get through, if there's time, I want to get through the quotes on Braxton Jones and Eddie Jackson next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Jase Medical. Jase is the makers of the Jase case. It's a pack of 5 different antibiotics that can treat a long list of illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, and others. The kind of stuff that can happen to any of us, especially this time of year, is that season of sickness. And with a Jase case, you've always got your medication on hand, even as pharmacies across the country deal with supply chain issues and shortages where people that need some of these medications aren't always able to get them right when they need to because sometimes they run out. And, they get restocked, and it's not a permanent shortage, but they run out, and when you need it right away. You're not there to wait days to get the medication to help you feel better. And so having a Jase case really gives me a lot of peace of mind. If you'd like to get your own, you can visit jasemedical.com and complete a physician encounter all online. Then it's reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications are dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com and use our promo code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. So we seem to have a good sense of Jaylen Johnson's future, Darnell Mooney's future, but a couple other guys have futures that are still up in the air this upcoming offseason, where it's like it's not a clear and obvious thing of what the Bears should do or what they're going to do or what even necessarily what's best for the team. And I think there's going to be a similar theme here for both players where Ryan Poles is keeping his options open intentionally in case he decides to make a change for either one of these players, but doesn't necessarily have to make a change with either one of these players. Braxton Jones and Eddie Jackson. Let's start with Eddie Jackson because to me, like, either way, Braxton Jones will be under contract next season. It's a question of whether he's the starter at left tackle or whether they try and upgrade left tackle. But even if they bring in an upgrade, he'll still be a backup at the very worst. But Eddie Jackson's the one where he's got a high salary this offseason. The Bears don't have like a clearly in place replacement plan or heir apparent to Eddie Jackson. But in terms of like biggest cap hits this season, Eddie Jackson was costing $18 million, third highest paid player on the Chicago Bears this season. Next year, that cap hit, 2024 is $18 million. This past year was 17. Now it's jumped up to $18 million is what he will cost the Chicago Bears this season. And if they released him, they would save $13 million. Like only about $5 million of that, just under $6 million of that is guaranteed. So the Chicago Bears are in a position right now where they could cut Eddie Jackson, save, again, what was the math, $13 million in salary cap space, and replace him and have a younger player at safety that doesn't cost nearly as much, and maybe use some of that other salary cap savings on other players as well. But here's how Ryan Poles talked about Eddie Jackson's value with the team without directly answering for sure whether he's back or not.
How did you evaluate Eddie's season and what's his future with the franchise?
Yeah, I know it didn't go exactly the way that he wanted to, just kind of being dinged up a little bit there. But I thought, where his impact is really with Brisker, the communication on the back end. When Eddie was in, you could tell Brisker felt really, really comfortable. Really, that whole group, he really impacts the communication, and you can see that.
I don't get a super clear read on that quote either way. Like, to me, that quote doesn't strongly say Eddie's back, and it doesn't strongly say Eddie's gone. It kind of strongly says, like, we like Eddie a lot, and he has value to our team. We'll see. Like, I think that's the approach here, where it's like, because I can see on the one hand where he's like, Eddie's so valuable to these young guys, that means we should bring him back. Like, his value is as a leader, and he helps these guys all be better. So, of course, we got to keep him around. I could see that argument. And I could also see the argument there where Ryan Poles says Eddie Jackson's value is not in his play. It's in his leadership and relation to these players. Like, he basically says there, like, Eddie didn't play that well, but he was good to have around for those guys. But if the premise is that Eddie didn't play that well, then are you going to keep a guy for $18 million a year that didn't play that well? Like, and do you think he's going to play better? Like, I don't think Eddie had a bad season by any means. Like, he was fine. He wasn't great, but he wasn't bad. But he wasn't $18 million good. And do you think he can get to be $18 million good next season? I mean, that's where I think Ryan Poles looks at it this way. If they go through this offseason and for some reason there's a safety that hits free agency that they just love and they can work out a deal with him, then maybe they'd sign that safety and cut Eddie Jackson. But if that doesn't happen, then they're happy to keep Eddie Jackson. And same thing with the draft. I think if they get to draft day and there's a safety there in the first round or in the second round or the third round or whatever that they love, and he's right there on their draft board and they think this guy can be our starting safety, then they take him. And maybe they cut Eddie Jackson and go on with the young guy. But if there's not, then they still have Eddie Jackson. Like, I think that's the approach here. I don't know that, this isn't necessarily even a full-on prediction, but like, I would think that's how they want to go. Like, they're not going to get rid of Eddie Jackson all willy-nilly without having some kind of replacement plan in place. And so I think they'll use that as like we could go either way on it. If a replacement presents itself to us, then we'll consider it and move on from Eddie Jackson. If a replacement doesn't present itself to us, we'll roll with Eddie Jackson and we'll feel very good about it. I think the conversation is exactly the same about Braxton Jones at left tackle, except instead of cutting him to save money, you're just benching him. But I think it's the same conversation with Braxton, where it's like, okay, we like Braxton Jones as a left tackle. In fact, let's start with what Ryan Poles said about Braxton Jones and then why I think there's some real parallels here.
Ryan, did Braxton Jones solidify himself at left tackle, or is that something where you're kind of not sure and could be like a high round pick as an upgrade? Where do you stand on him?
Yeah, I thought Braxton did a good job. Obviously, he got a little dinged up. That was the first time he's missed a game. He did a nice job. He continues to get better. I was proud of the progress. He spent a lot of time with Olin this offseason, just working on his anchor, and I thought you saw improvements there. I do believe he's a starting left tackle. But if it comes down to a situation where we increase competition, then that's what's best for us, then we'll do that. But I'm proud of Braxton.
Yeah, I think that's an honest assessment. I believe him, right? Like, yes, they view Braxton Jones as a starting caliber left tackle. If they go through this whole offseason without upgrading left tackle, they'll feel like they're okay with Braxton Jones there. But if they go into free agency and a great left tackle becomes available that they think would be a clear upgrade, they might sign him. And if they go into the draft and there's a left tackle in the first round or anywhere in that draft that they feel like could be a clear upgrade over Braxton Jones, they'll draft him. And they're not worried about, creating competition at that position or anything like that. Like they'll happily add an upgrade if it presents itself to them. And they'll, the threshold for what's an upgrade over Braxton Jones might be lower, and that's okay. But they still view him as a guy that if they don't upgrade the position, they feel okay about it. And we've seen Ryan Poles take that approach at other positions in the past where he says, like, listen, if we can get an upgrade and create more competition, we will, but I like the guys we have now. I mean, that was the approach on the defensive line last season. It was the approach at a few different spots along the way, running back as well. Like, yeah, they found an opportunity to add other players there that upgraded them. So they did. But they were happy going into the season with the guys that they just had and said, this is good enough as is, but if we can make it better and there's a clear and obvious way to do so that is, easy enough for the team to do, we're going to do that. And I think that's the approach at left tackle with Braxton Jones. I think that's the approach at safety with Eddie Jackson. I think they'll be more deliberate about upgrading the center position. We'll see what they end up doing at right guard with Nate Davis. I think they'll say that was fine, but I don't think he had a particularly great year. They're certainly going to want to add some tight end depth. Of course, this offseason, I think they need to do the same thing on the defensive line, keep adding to that spot. Like, we'll get through some of the Bears' biggest team needs as we get more and more into the offseason here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you can keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Going to start bringing a couple other guests on throughout the offseason here to talk about the big Bears offseason moves and decisions ahead, decisions already made, decisions still to be made. So we're going to get some different voices involved here in the podcast in the coming days and weeks. I hope that adds to the conversation for you. Should be some fun back and forth with some fun people in and around the Bears media, especially people you might know from Twitter and people you might not be as familiar with, but I'm happy to introduce you to some of my favorite people. I don't just put any old person on this podcast just for the sake of putting somebody on the podcast. Like, it's people whose opinions I value and whose time I value and people who I think, are not this is some sacred resource, but I don't just hand it out all willy-nilly. It's people that I like and trust that get on this podcast and not just whoever's popular or whatever, whatever kind of attention that might get me. Like, no, I want to have good, informative conversations and analysis about your Chicago Bears. That I will always promise you. And of course, I will always promise you another opportunity to bear down.